All right. Thanks, Mikhail. The paper which is going to be presented now is going to be delivered by Katarzyna Bielinska, and she is going to present a paper entitled Marxist Humanism as the Philosophy of Self-Management. That's a question, basically. Its rise and eclipse in Yugoslavia and Poland. Katarzyna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, first and foremost, for your kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to express my deep thanks to my friends and colleagues from Prague, with whom we have a great opportunity to collaborate. And a special thanks to Professor Berankova for organizing this event and for doing a really, really huge job to manage everybody and to enabling us to meet here. Thank you very much. First two remarks. In my reflection, I'm trying to adopt historical materialist approach. That is, I believe that philosophies should not be analyzed in abstraction, but as a part of a social whole, as a material social whole. And the second remark, we are talking here mainly about the period of the real socialism. So, for me, the real socialism is not socialism at all. It is a bureaucratic regime based on the exploitation of the working class, in which the ruling bureaucracy has the surplus product for its disposal. It is very important because sometimes some confusions can arise around that. And that bureaucratic ruling was constantly opposed by the working class. We can give examples like Poznań uprising in Poland, Workers' Council's movement in Poland, Belgrade June, 68, etc., etc. And for the moment, I will use the term Marxist humanism, not getting into details what I really mean through that, and but as it is broadly adopted as a current which emerged in Eastern Europe as anti-Stalinist and returning to Marx, not only to the young Marx, but returning to rejecting the dogmatic, rejecting this Stalinist dogmatism and returning to the real Marx. Yeah. So we will be talking about Poland and Yugoslavia, and those regimes were essentially different, as Poland was the part of the Soviet bloc. The regime was implemented there from above, although its social reforms were welcome and the masses were anti-capitalism, but it's another story. But it was in principle imposed from above, and it had a very strong nationalist side. As Paweł Szelegieniec writes, the regime in Poland, from the very beginning, was blocking the independent workers' initiative. Yeah. And in Yugoslavia, the situation was different. We had there a mass, popular, victorious revolution led by the Communist Party, with whose very important side was anti-nationalism. 1948, we have Tito-Stalin split, which makes anti-Stalinism a part of the official ideology, and then the introduction of workers' self-management. And as Ernst Mandel has written about the Yugoslav system, it was contradictory. It was bureaucratized. It was a camouflage rather than disalienation. But anyway, the introduction, and I'm citing, the introduction of the self-management system into industry of Yugoslavia has created conditions there which were far more favorable to the emergence of genuine workers' power than those existing in any of the other countries where capitalism has been abolished. Yeah? So we have a difference. We have a different situation. And of course, there is a huge literature about workers' self-management, but I would like here to pay attention just to one aspect. That is the experience of self-management. That is empowerment and agency. And let me cite Lechosław Goździk, the leader of the worker conscience movement in Poland in 1956. It was interesting how the people's consciousness that we can take things into our own hands was developing. People felt that the factories were theirs. And from Yugoslavia, it was a research, an anthropological research done among Yugoslav workers. It is cited by Girdesic in his work, from another book by Drezga. When you get into self-management, you can't stop. Many nights I couldn't sleep. I used to come home, toss and turn, and worried how we are going to solve this, how we are going to solve that. I spent most of my free time on these meetings. I have already had problems with my wife. All you do is to worry about these meetings, she says. These preparations, you lock yourself in the room. I read newspapers, various materials. Yeah, so we can see that on the empirical level, on the level of experience, the experience of that activity is compatible with that Marxist humanist concept of the creative, active and creative subject. Yeah. However, the producers of Marxist humanists were not workers, but not organic intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, but rather traditional intelligentsia, as a strata which evolved, which is typical for countries of backward capitalism. Yeah? Let's cite Haas. People educated above the average level, for whom that education is the basic source of income. Yeah. And for instance, we see it very clearly in Poland, where we had that after the war, as young students, future Marxist humanism like Kołakowski and Baczko, they were gathered. They were studying at Łódź University because Łódź University was established in Łódź because Warsaw was totally destroyed. Yeah, and what they were doing there, they were, for instance, organizing the preparatory courses for children from working class families to go to university. So they were doing proper intelligentsia jobs, yeah? And the similar situation was in Yugoslav partisans. Lots of young intellectuals joined the partisan ranks. Of course, they were fighting there, but at the same time, they were doing teaching, they were organizing cultural events, again, doing those typical intelligentsia jobs, yeah? And the point is that they inherited not only the class privilege, but also a certain education. And in my opinion, it was not like that Marxist humanism emerged in Eastern Europe as a simple awakening from the dogmatic Stalinist nap. Rather, from the very beginning, Marxism was appropriated in the preceding philosophical context, or also in confrontation with it, which was the case in Poland. Yeah, and in Poland, what had a very important impact on future Marxist humanism, it was the tradition of the Lviv-Warsaw School. Lviv-Warsaw School. So understood broadly, that means including such progressive intellectuals, not only Kotarbiński or Ajdukiewicz, but also Ossowska and Ossowski. Yeah? And they were those left-wing anti-fascists, pre-war anti-fascists, were teachers of the Marxist students. Yeah? They were later attacked by them, but it is another story. And in Zagreb, that was Vladimir Filipowicz, a pre-war philosopher specialized in German classical philosophy, whose impact can be seen from the very beginning of the writings, on the writings of such authors like Milan Kundera, or also there was Rudy Supek, a very well-known praxis philosopher who was older than the rest of praxis philosophers, and had done his PhD by Jean Piaget. In Belgrade, the situation was different because the whole philosophical faculty was in the hands of Dusan Nedeljković, and Dusan Nedeljković was a typical follower of Diamat and Zhdanov. But the Yugoslav students very early could go abroad to study. And for instance, Mihailo Markovic and Gajo Petrovic in the 50s, they were studying by Alfred Ayer. So we have that whole philosophical context in which that critical Marxism was emerging. Also, this is the context, but in Poland, for instance, Jan Kołakowski, as early as at the end of the 40s, emphasized the active role of the subject in the process of cognition. And he wrote that. How much time? Okay. So I will not cite. Also, the concept of alienation appeared very early in 1949 with the translation of Lefebvre. Marx and the idea of freedom. So those concepts, those ideas entered Polish Marxism relatively early, and the same was in Yugoslavia. Although the general situation, the general conditions were more favorable, as I have mentioned, yeah. But we have the journal Pogledi. The journal Pogledi, published from 1952 with Supek as an editor-in-chief. which was focusing on humanism, on the question of the man as an individual and social being, on the question of alienation, and closely binding the idea of humanism with self-management. What does socialist self-management as the basis of socialist humanism mean? Asked Supek. The turn to the concrete man. So the turning point seems the moment when that critical apparatus is turned against local bureaucracies. Yeah, it is a political gesture. For instance, earlier the category of alienation was used to criticize the capitalism. Yeah, so it was clear. And the existing of alienation in real socialism is acknowledged in both cases, yeah, and the criticism against the ruling bureaucracy is developed. And again, that intellectual criticism corresponds with the anti-bureaucratic social tendencies, like, as I have mentioned, workers' councils movement in Poland, or 68 in Yugoslavia. But we can pose a question, is it a real philosophy of those movements, yeah, of those tendencies? Maybe I will, yeah. We can emphasize that that criticism of bureaucracy is a reflection of theoretical debates. That is, when we had theory of reflection contested by the revolutionary practice, yeah, and we had a well-known debate, for instance, in Bled in 1960. Yeah? It is a date which is in Yugoslav philosophy, it is a symbol of breaking with the Stalinism in philosophy. Borislav Mikulic names it a repetition of 1948 in philosophy. Yeah? But and we have that opposition, theory of reflection and revolutionary practice. And on the political and social dimension, this opposition is reflected by the opposition, the bureaucracy, and workers' self-management. Yeah? And when writing, the theoreticians of workers' self-management were writing about it, they again emphasized that active moment that, let me cite, the self-management means that the functions of the directing social process are no longer performed by forces outside the masses of society, opposed to it, but are in the hands of the very same people who create social life, yeah? Or, it was Mihailo Markovic, or Wranicki. No state can substitute the activity of the millions. No state, even the best administered, can substitute for the zeal of a man who knows and feels that the destiny of his own community is in his hands, etc., etc., etc. Yeah. So okay. So the question, just 2 minutes. Okay. So the question of the question of alienation in socialism was, for instance, in Yugoslavia, a central question. The praxis philosophers developed a criticism of bureaucratic alienation in the name of self-management. But we all know what has happened later. I mean that we have that rise of pro-workers, pro-self-management thinking, and then after 68, which was a start of a huge repressions towards Praxis and towards students' movements in Yugoslavia. Praxis was stopped from being published, and Praxis philosophers were expelled from the Belgrade University. In Poland, it was it was 68. It was March. It was an anti-Semitic cleansing, which meant a huge crash on the intellectual life. Yeah, and then after that, we have evolution, anti-Marxist, so-called anti-Marxist evolution of its protagonists, of Marxist humanists. And I will not now. I thought I will not have time to get into theoretical details, but briefly. I was trying in my PhD dissertation, I was trying to explain that evolution theoretically, introducing the distinction of the epistemic and epistemological theory, fields of theory, which was introduced into Polish philosophy by Marek Siemek, but following Althusser. That is, that humanism is anti-theoretical. There is no humanist Marxism. Yeah? It is a narrative, it's an ideology, but it is not as Marxist. It is not Marxist theory. Yeah. But here I suppose that this analysis should be, what should be added to this analysis is the question of the class position of the producers of Marxist humanism. Yeah, because most of them, as I have mentioned, were from intelligentsia families, and they were professional intellectuals, and they defended their position as intellectuals, as Kołakowski has written as early in 1968. That's why I think that for Kołakowski the turn has started earlier. Intellectuals are not the helpers of workers' movement. They are its absolute condition. We have something like that. And so, to conclude, Marxist humanism could play a progressive role in certain moment, but it was a convergent thing. It was a contingent thing. It's a contingent thing because it could not sustain the dynamics of historical events, because it was, on one hand, theoretically, it did not reach the proper theoretical level and stayed in that epistemic field of theory. And on the other hand, its producers were from the strata whose first and foremost interest, whose main interest was to keep their position as a strata. So I think that we could finish here, and then we can discuss. Thank you.